Hi, everybody. We're just waiting while everybody comes in to this webinar from Transform Justice. I'm waiting for a signal from my colleague Fanula when to actually start it in terms of people coming in.
Yeah, we're at 50, so
I think we'll wait 1 minute.
Yeah, it's still creeping up. Let's give another minute or so.
Yeah. Welcome, everybody. If you've just joined, we're just waiting a couple of minutes here. Okay, I think I'll start and people will join as we're going along. Those who've heard it, welcome to this seminar, Soft Justice or Sensible Justice, How to Promote Effective Diversion. And welcome to all of you who've come on this. I'm Penelope Gibbs from Transform Justice, a charity which advocates for a fairer and more humane justice system. So we've been working for the last 18 months on a program to promote effective diversion from court. Today we're launching a new guide on how to communicate that approach. So that guide was in the link that you got today about this event, and we're also going to put it in the chat later. So it's a guide you can print off or look up online, which should, we hope, help you think about how to communicate, either talking to people or in written form, about effective diversion. So what we're talking about is all those sanctions and approaches that the police use if they don't charge a crime, but the person accepts some responsibility. So we're talking about cautions, community resolutions, penalty notices, and diversion to services where there's no formal sanction. We'll take you through current trends in diversion, some research we've done with police, and about public attitudes. And we have two great guests who you can see. One is Commander Dr. Alison Heydari, who is joining us from her phone because the police wouldn't allow Zoom.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We've had so many technical issues here, but really glad to join you, Penelope.
Great. Well, we can see and hear you fine. So that's good. The wonders of mobile phones. And we also have Rick Muir, who is director of the Police Foundation. I think is also a doctor. So what we've got today is a webinar format of Zoom, as you can probably see, which means that at the bottom where you've got the chat, you've also got a function Q&A. And what we would say is, we love people to ask their own questions later in person, but can you put your question in that Q&A bit, and then we can come to you later for you to actually put the question. Also, do use the chat absolutely as much as you want to put in comments. And if there are questions in the chat, we'll try and get to those as well. So I'm afraid this thing means you, the audience, are not on video. But when we come to get you to ask questions, we will be able to hear you. So that'd be great. So do put questions on throughout, and we will try and answer them at whatever stage. And the others in the team I just wanted to introduce you to are Fionnuala Radcliffe, who's going to be presenting in a minute, and Alex Kimmons, who's helping on the technical side and on the chat and so on. So in terms of getting going, what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit of a presentation, discussion with Rick and Ali, then presentation, discussion with Rick and Ali, and then come to questions. And it's an hour's webinar. So let's crack on. First of all, I'd like to turn to Fionnuala to take us through some latest trends and public attitudes about this agenda.
Thanks, Penelope. I'm just going to share my screen with some slides. So hopefully everyone can see that. So so before we kind of get into the bulk of our research, just a bit of context. So really part of the impetus for this work that we're doing and this project is that out of court disposal use has been declining quite significantly for many years now. So you can see from this trend, this graph here, the top line, so that dark blue one shows the number of cases charged or summoned, and how that's changed, and it itself has declined since 2009, but nowhere near as much as the use of out-of-court disposals, which, as you can see, has totally plummeted over the past decade or so. You can see community resolutions is that green line, which is introduced in 2015. So that's the time since we've had data available. That's remained fairly steady, and overall out-of-court disposals has decreased significantly. So what we also know is across forces, there's quite a variety of use of out-of-court disposals. So in some areas, as you can see here on the left-hand side, the text is quite small, sorry, but it's a list of all police forces in England and Wales. And in some forces, say Surrey, currently the Met at the top, roughly about half or a bit less than half of crimes which could be prosecuted are charged. The rest are given an out-of-court disposal. But at the other end of the scale, in some forces, it's up to 70 or 80% of cases which could be charged, which are sent to court. So there's a big variety, and just to say the average is about 2/3 of those cases are going to charge. So there's scope, we think, to increase their use, and it would be good if we could, especially because we think the evidence for diversion and out-of-court disposals is good. So here's a chart on reoffending, and this is statistics from the Ministry of Justice. And the key thing here, I suppose, is on the left-hand side, the reoffending rate for the simple caution is 14%, which is a lot lower than many other disposals. So reoffending rate here is the proportion of people who received that disposal who then went on to commit another offence within the next year. So to us, this is a kind of really positive evidence for the simple caution. We'd love to see what the similar stat would be for community resolutions. That's not publicly available, but if anyone has that data and is able to get it, we'd be really interested, because we think that could be quite positive too. So it's not just reoffending, I guess, if we're thinking about kind of the evidence of the benefits of diversion and out-of-court disposals. It can also be a positive experience for victims. So one example here, there's not absolutely realms of data on victims' experience of out-of-court disposals, and we'd like to see more of that too. But for example, this data is from the Turning Point evaluation. So the Turning Point was a programme of deferred prosecution. So people who commit a crime and are eligible and meet the threshold for prosecution were given the opportunity to avoid prosecution by complying with a certain set of conditions which were devised and agreed, and if they completed those conditions, they didn't have to go to court. So this was run in the West Midlands about 8 years ago or so, and I know it's being used and trialled in some other places in the country. But the key thing here is that victim satisfaction for those where the cases went through Turning Point was significantly higher than comparable cases which went through court. So, and this is where the victim also received a phone call to let them know what was happening with the case. That also made a difference to how satisfied they were. So, and you can also see on the right hand side costs, so the processing costs for that case. Even in Turning Point, which some of you may know is a fairly intensive programme and requires some police resources to do a needs assessment of the person who committed the crime and follow up on conditions. Even with all of that, the cost per case was lower, I think about £1,000 per case lower on average. So to us, this all adds up to pretty good evidence for diversion and out-of-court disposals. What we do unfortunately see is mainly negative media about them in general. So I guess it's worth saying, often say in policy discussions or public conversations about how we could deal with crime, diversion and out-of-court disposals are not coming up that often, but where they do, it tends to be a little on the negative side. So you can see some examples of headlines here talking about dealing with things informally, avoiding and escaping prosecution, leniency, soft option, letting people off. So the media tends to be pretty negative when they're talking about ways to resolve crimes that don't involve going to court. And what we wanted to find out was, does that negativity, is that reflected in police attitudes and also public attitudes? So the bulk of what I'm going to cover is about the public, but just for your interest, we've also done, and we are still doing a bit of work researching police attitudes in a few different forces that we're working in. So we basically asked them several questions through a survey, one of which was, do you think in your force out-of-court disposals are used about the right amount? Should they be used more? Should they be used less? And overall, so about half said they think they should be used more, and a further quarter said they used about the right amount. Only 2% said they should be used less, and the rest weren't sure. So overall, in that particular force, and it seems to be playing out in a couple of other forces that we're working with, police attitudes tend to be neutral or supportive of out-of-court disposals. And I'll just show you quickly a few attitudes from the police as well. So we asked how much they agreed, for example, that diversion and out-of-court disposals is a sensible response to crime and delivers satisfactory outcomes to victims. So as you can see here, there's a lot of support and agreement with those top three statements, and less so with the ones at the bottom, which tend to be more oriented towards the person who committed the crime. So not much agreement from police and quite a lot of disagreement that diversion and out-of-court disposals tackles the root causes of crimes. So that's from one particular force, and we're going to be interested in working with other forces to see if that plays out there as well. So we also, much of what we're talking about today is public attitudes. And when we asked the public whether how much they supported resolving crimes without going to court, what we found was people are much more supportive than in opposition to policies to resolve more crimes without going to court. So 58% support or strongly support, and that's versus 17% who opposed. So to us, that's really good news, that there's a kind of baseline level of support amongst the public for these policies. When we drill down a bit into that, you can see here that there was kind of agreement that it's a good use of police resources, a sensible response to crime, particularly in comparison to those who disagreed. So that's an overall good level of support. On the right-hand side, less so. So people not so convinced they tackle the root causes of crime. And we're going to talk later in our messaging findings about how we can shift that support a little bit higher. Thanks. I'm going to hand back to Penelope now.
Thanks very much. And I'm just going to now ask Rick and Ali a few reflections on that. Can I just say, I forgot to say that Ali is here because she is the National Police Chiefs Council lead on out-of-court disposals. So it's her agenda area. Ali, I'm going to start with you. And I'm going to bring you back to that marked decline that we saw on the chart in the use of out-of-court disposals over the last 10 years, particularly the more formal out-of-court disposals, even compared to court disposals. Why do you think that has happened?
I think there may be several reasons for this. As you were talking, actually, Fanula, I was thinking about the performance culture within policing, but I was also thinking about the messaging around being tough on crime and how that has been received by members of the public, and the police are the public. So as you were talking, I was thinking, actually, can this be something to do with, first of all, the messaging around the use of out-of-court disposals, but also the availability of the resources that would be placed with an out-of-court disposal, and that diversion that would go with an out-of-court disposal. And I think there are many things that go on outside of policing in terms of social attitudes that can have an impact on what we do, and those are some of my immediate thoughts around this.
And presumably you would like that trajectory to change.
Absolutely, absolutely. And within my business plan, one of my proposals in the business plan with some timescales and milestones is to see an increase in the use of out-of-court disposals, because I think it is an incredible tool, prevention tool, to be able to, first of all, identify the issues relating to that particular person and how we can help that person not to reoffend again. But I feel actually very, very passionately around trying to keep people out of the criminal justice system, because once you're in that system, it is very, very difficult to get out of it. As we all know, there's impact, sometimes lifelong impact, around coming into a criminal justice system which you can't get out of, which can be an incredibly negative experience for people and for society and for business and all sorts. So yes, I would really like to see that trajectory turn around.
Rick, we saw that chart with the use from different police forces of out-of-court disposals, and obviously, if Cleveland had the same usage as Surrey, you would automatically vastly increase the use of out-of-court disposals. Why do you think there's such a huge difference between police forces in their use?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I mean, the two sort of possible explanations that I can think of around that. One is it something to do with the nature of those localities? But I don't think that is true, because when you look at that chart, you see lots of large urban areas and also rural areas kind of scattered in different locations on the chart. So it doesn't seem to be anything to do with sort of geography or demography. I think it's probably much more to do with localism, and the fact is that policing is a locally devolved, locally governed service, and different police forces will take a different approach to this, and that's in part due to the operational independence of the chief constable and the other chief officers, and also in part due to the priorities of the police and crime commissioners in different areas. So I think it's local political choice, and you probably have at the top of that chart some forces who've run with this agenda because they believe in it and they're passionate about it, and others where it's not really caught on yet. So that's clearly the challenge in terms of spreading spreading the impact.
Ali, you mentioned that you'd really like to reverse the decline in the use of out-of-court disposals compared to court disposals. So the government have got new proposals coming in on out-of-court disposals, and we all thought, I think, that they were just simply going to legislate for what's called the two-tier approach, which some forces use, which is the usage of community resolutions and conditional cautions, and just those two. But in fact, the legislation has put forward a three-tier system, which is community resolutions and two new disposals, the community caution and the diversionary caution. Have you got any concern that this change about over three different systems in the end is going to be a barrier to doing what you want to do?
Yes, I do have some concerns, and we have spoken about those concerns, haven't we, face to face. I have raised some concerns around change, because I think there's a certain amount of perceived change fatigue within the criminal justice system. And of course, out-of-court disposals and community resolutions are just one aspect of policing among many other priorities that police officers have to consider in their day-to-day delivery of justice. So yes, I am concerned about it. However, I think the way forward is to make sure that we get the training right, that we work with partners such as yourselves and the College of Policing and other stakeholders to ensure that officers understand the importance of out-of-court disposals. And in that, the messaging will be really, really important, so that they understand the importance of it. And then they can go forward with the new changes in legislation in a really positive manner. So yes, I think there are some difficulties. However, I see things as very positive in the way in which the stakeholder engagement has gone so far. And in my plans are to really go forward, working with you and other stakeholders to ensure we get the messaging and the training right. And that messaging is internal in policing as well as external.
That's great. And I'll ask Alex to put in the chat a link to our briefing, the Transform Justice briefing on the bill, from which you can get an idea of what the changes will be to out-of-court disposals. Rick, we saw a lot of those media headlines, and Fionnuala mentioned that negative coverage. So we've got negative stories in the mainstream press, but our research, which we've just seen, says that the public is not there, that in the main, they support an approach which involves resolving crimes without going to court. So what's happening in the media there? Why is that the repository of the negative stories?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is that part of it's about negativity. So, you tend to get more negative headlines than positive headlines generally. But I think it's also probably, I'm not sure it's a sort of, there's any kind of agenda here or anything. I think it's more that some of the newspapers are probably feeding back to their readers what they think their readers will think. And maybe therefore the issue here for organisations like Transform Justice and others is to try and is to demonstrate actually that public opinion is more nuanced and complex than perhaps it's perceived to be. So maybe the editorial line in those newspapers is following what they think is public skepticism about out-of-court disposals, that they're soft, it's kind of letting people off, letting them go free and all of that stuff. But actually, your evidence shows that, actually people, when the evidence is presented effectively, people are supportive. So there's probably something about making the media familiar with public attitudes, because I think they're probably going on a perception of where they think the public is, and that's something that could be challenged, I think.
Thanks very much, Rick. So we're just going to actually go to that, some research, more of the research we've done on exactly how we could message successfully about resolving crimes without going to court. So I'm going to, and then we're going to come back to Rick and Ali. So Fionnuala, over to you.
Okay, just sharing my screen again. So yeah, I'm gonna, the second research, the question that we were looking at, besides kind of what our public attitudes was, which messages are more or less effective in generating support for resolving crimes without going to court. So firstly, I guess a few slides coming up on understanding and how we can increase understanding about resolving crimes without going to court. So a key thing coming out of our focus groups and from the survey that we did, this is a nationally representative survey, was that people don't instantly understand what diversion from court is, what diversion means, what out-of-court disposals are. For the most part, if you speak to people about how to resolve crime, people think courts and they think prisons. So if you are trying to get them to think about something else, so like this different part of ways of dealing with crime, you need to work a little harder to get them to understand what you're saying. And that means explaining yourself very clearly. So what helps people understand our messages about resolving crimes without going to court? So firstly, terminology. I'm just going to move this on here. So we tested with the public various ways of describing what we're talking about, so including some of those common terms that we all use in the sector, like diversion, like out-of-court disposals or approaches. And what we found was all of those terms that we're using to the public don't mean that much, or they send people off on slightly wrong tracks or bring up some negative associations. So some of which you can kind of see listed here, and there's more detail in the guide. And our conclusion really was that if we're talking about this topic, it's best to spell it out in as plain English as possible, even if that takes more words. So the term that we used and worked well was resolving crime without going to court, which is more of a mouthful than diversion, but for us, it helped people understand what we were saying. So that's just this plain English thing, I think, is worth bearing in mind in any of your communications you're making publicly. So that's kind of terminology, and that's very important for understanding, but there's other ways that we can increase understanding as well. So one of those is about introducing examples to any messaging or quotes that we're giving about resolving crimes without going to court. So what we did in our survey and also in our focus groups is we showed people particular specific examples of how diversion or an out-of-court disposal might be used and for the particular type of crime. So here are 3 examples that we tried out here, one about a woman who's shoplifting, another about a fight in a pub, another about someone who's spraying graffiti. And what we found through the survey is that adding an example increased support. So you can see here on the top, with the top line, we asked people kind of generally, how much do you support or oppose policies to resolve more crimes without going to court? And that 58% is that stat that we saw earlier at the start, which is a good level of support indeed. But when we asked people specifically about a particular example, so here this one about the woman who's arrested for shoplifting, and instead of being sent to court, she's sent for drug and alcohol counselling. And when we asked people specifically about how much they supported that course of action, support shot up. So 74% supported it, that's so 3/4 is a really high level of support. And we saw something similar for the example about the fights and two men in a pub having a fight and break the window, and they were asked to pay for damages. For when we added the caution for the graffiti example, it did increase a bit, but not as much. So that might be something to do with which example you choose and how people feel the disposal connects with the action. So certainly adding examples increases support. do have a look in our guide about metaphors, which are another way to increase support, but we won't go into that here. Instead, we'll move on to talking about values in messaging. So what is a value? I suppose that the value, is really what the issue is about, why it matters and why people should care about it. So if we have created various messages with values in them, and the good thing about kind of leading with a value in your message is two things really. One is that it tells people why they should care and why they should keep on reading. It kind of hooks them in, as it were. And secondly, it can help if we include a value which is commonly held by most people in the country, then we can increase support for what we're talking about. So if you think that most of the public, there's some commonly held values in this country, for example, that we should be tolerant of each other, or that we should be able to speak freely and openly. So if we can use some of these commonly held values and frame our argument about resolving crimes without going to court in a way that aligns with these values, we're kind of speaking to something that people already agree with. And by doing that, we're going to be able to increase support for what we're saying. So we found that there were three really values that we could use that worked to increase support for resolving crimes without going to court. So the first one was pragmatism. So this is kind of something like problem solving, a focus on solutions rather than principles or ideals. So in the crime and justice context, it's something like there's evidence, we have the evidence for what works well. If we follow that evidence and if we take a common sense approach, and if we focus on what's feasible and practical, we will improve our response to crime and improve our criminal justice system. So there's two ways we can use this, and we tested both and both worked well. One was about pragmatism with a kind of reducing crime bent. So our response to crime should help communities feel safer and work better. So that's about kind of resolving crimes without going to court can help us reduce crime and make communities feel safer. And we might draw on some of that reoffending evidence, for example, that we talked about earlier. Another way we can use this pragmatism value is with a focus on addressing the harms caused to victims. So if you just pick someone on the street and ask them about crime, for the most part, they're going to be thinking, most people will think about crime from the perspective of them as a victim. And so if you can tap into that, you're going to increase how well you're understood and how people kind of respond to what you're saying. So we can kind of say, when we're talking about resolving crimes without going to court, court is sometimes not a great experience for victims. It can be slow and scary, and that these other ways of dealing with crime, such as diversion and out-of-court disposals, can be better for the victims. I've got a little asterisk there because what we found was, although this value increased support, and it is really useful to use because of this thing that people think of themselves as victims for the most part, there is slightly less trust in this claim that resolving crimes without going to court is good for victims. So if you're going to say that, you've got to back it up with some evidence, like the turning point evidence we talked about earlier, or a case study or story of a victim going through one of these processes. The third value, just quickly, because I'm looking at the time, is human potential. So this is more about kind of rehabilitation and allowing people to achieve their potential, and that the way we respond to crime should help people rehabilitate. So that's a kind of shift from the kind of victim or pragmatism angle, but we found that's really useful to trigger in people's mind this idea that the criminal justice system and our response to crime should be helping people rehabilitate. Okay, just final minute, and it's a couple of values to avoid. So if you're thinking about how you might persuade someone that resolving crimes without going to court is a good idea, there's some arguments that work and some that don't, and some we found didn't work were these two here. So the first one is about swift and speedy justice. Particularly at this time, there's a court backlog. The length of time that it takes for a case to get through court is increasing. It's tempting to say, you know, resolving crimes without going to court is a solution because it's faster. And that may be true, but it did not go down well with members of the public. And we can see that here from this quote, that the courts are fair in terms of hearing every side, and that's why it's important, and swifter suggests rushing justice. So if we were to lead with anything about speedy justice, we're going to come up against this concern there. I think I've run over time, so I won't have a read in the guide about the new and innovative approaches, or I can expand more in the Q&A. But thanks very much, and back to Penelope for discussion.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think the point about new and innovative is that in the justice context, people are a bit nervous about things which are new and innovative, not within the justice system, but from outside it, because it's such a sort of precious thing. First of all, I'd just like to ask Ali. So we've got really quite strong support from the public for resolving crimes without going to court. Does that surprise you in any way?
No, it doesn't actually. I think members of the public know what is good for them, and they know what they need out of the criminal justice system. So that doesn't surprise me. And I think on that basis, we need to build on the facts. I think it's actually it's a very positive thing to know that your research has indicated that members of the public are supportive. And so we need to build on that. So, you know, the slide shows that already we're thinking about messaging, what works, what doesn't. And so we've got a really good base from which to build our messaging. As I said before, that's going to be really important out to communities, but also within policing to get that right.
Rick, obviously we've recommended not using all the language that the sector normally uses. Does that resonate for you, that when you talk in using some of these terms to people who are not in the criminal justice sector, they have not the foggiest what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, things like diversion, people don't really understand what that is. Out of court. I mean, people are very familiar with the serious end. You know, they're very familiar. The stuff that you see on the telly, you read about in books. It's all, you know, murders, and it's at that end of things. And they're familiar with courts, and they're familiar with prisons. The rest of it, people are very unfamiliar with. You know, people don't write crime dramas about diversion schemes and so on, you know, so there's a lack of familiarity with it. So I think people aren't used to the language. It's also interesting that a lot of the language that we use in the sector, within policing, within public services, things like talking about demand reduction and things like this, you know, those arguments didn't go down particularly well with the public, I see in your research either. So I think we all need to study this work, because a lot of the technical language that professionals, academics, practitioners and others use simply doesn't communicate effectively to the public what is actually going on.
So Ali, about half the police think that we should use out of court disposals more, and very few think we should use them less. Given that the public are also supportive, do you think that the police and PCC should be more proactive as opposed to this kind of under the radar stuff in talking about resolving crimes without going to court?
Well, I think they're there are some PCCs and forces, chief constables and their teams who are actually very, very proactive. And I think that is probably being reflected in some of the earlier slides that we saw. So I think local leadership is making a big difference in some forces. My view around that is going forward in my business plan, I really want to build on the good practice that we've already seen in that leadership and share that. I think in policing we need to share what works a bit more effectively so that we can understand what's worked in some place and see whether or not that can be replicated or used in some way, shape, form in another force. You know, Turning Point is a really good example of that. The Met in West Yorkshire at the moment currently replicating Turning Point and building the evidence base. And I'd like to see more of that, really building an evidence base, looking at the evidence base that we already have, for example, around Operation Cara for domestic abuse, and understanding what the evidence looks like and what it means, and trying to replicate that good practice across the UK.
That's great. Now I can see that we've got several questions, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alex or Fanula. I don't know who's going to do it, to tee up a question from one of our audience members.
I think Alex has got it.
Yeah, I've got it. So hi, everyone. We've had some interesting discussion in the chat about the use of the word disposal. So that's something to think about. I think the first question we're going to take is from Andrew Curry. Andrew, I'm going to allow you to talk now. And if you'd like to ask your question out loud.
Andrew, you need to unmute. I can see you're on mute.
Right. Thank you, Alex. Alison, thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Gives me some optimism. To what extent does your average police officer in their day-to-day work able to influence what these outcomes might be at the end of a procedure?
Andrew, are you a police officer? I'm just interested.
No, nothing like that. No involvement in the police, just a member of the public.
Okay, Alison.
So Andrew, in terms of influencing, I think, if I'm honest, that can vary from force to force. I think there are some forces that are better at obtaining new ideas and innovation from their staff. But one of the things that I'm really keen to do is to make sure that we build in innovation into our response around out-of-court disposals going forward, and that's something that's in my business plan. So I'm very much in favour of learning, introducing new ways of working. If they don't work, then we've learned from them. We can move on to implementing some other innovation. So I think that's the long answer. The short answer is that I think it varies, but I would like to see more influence from practitioners who are out there delivering this day to day. Make sure that we have some mechanisms to bring back that learning and their observations and new ideas into the system so that we can try as many new things as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Alex, I think you're going to read out a question from one of our audience.
Yeah, so we've had a question from Ashley, who is not able to ask live, so I'll ask on her behalf. The question is for Fanula. From your research, do you know the why behind why both the public and police officers appear to agree that out-of-court disposals don't address the root causes of crime?
Hi, Ashley, thanks. So on the police side, I have to say they're very top line survey findings you've seen there. We do have some qualitative responses which will help us get at the why from police, but not yet on that side. On the public side, yeah, so through our focus groups that we did with members of the public, we did get at some of their concerns and reasons for and against resolving crimes without going to court. In terms of what their concerns were regarding tackling the root cause of crime, I guess there's a feeling, several feelings really, I suppose. One about kind of just a general feeling that it's too soft an approach and therefore it's not going to be a deterrent. So do have a read of our wider reframing guide, handy guide, which kind of talks about some of these beliefs that people hold about crime and justice. And one of them that's really strong is that we should be punishing people because then that will deter them from committing crime again. Now, the evidence for deterrence is not very good, but anyway, that is a view. And so there's a bit of a feeling that this, the diversion and out-of-court disposals won't address that. I mean, in terms of tackling root causes, there's also a bit of a feeling, a skepticism that this won't work as well for people who commit crimes, repeat offences, or particularly people who commit very violent crimes. There's just a kind of lack of faith that this is going to do anything there from members of the public. A bit of concern that there's not enough resources to provide the services that's needed to tackle the root causes here. But I think it's just worth saying that the messaging findings and the values and the understanding that we talked through at the end, when we use those messages, support and agreement with this statement that resolving crimes without going to court will increase, tends to tackle the root causes of crime. Agreement with that statement really increased very significantly, in fact, the most significantly across all of those factors. So the messaging can be really important here for increasing support.
Great. Alex, next one up.
Thanks very much. I'm going to invite Guyan to ask your question about solicitors. I'll allow you to talk now, and then you need to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I was thinking during the presentation whether you trained solicitors about out-of-court settlement as well, because as a lecturer, we do a lot of work in ADR for civil cases, but I don't think we spend so much time on out-of-court disposal for criminal as well.
Yeah, I think I think that defense solicitors, so out of court disposals aren't really mediation. They're very different. There's a decision made by the police officer when someone accepts responsibility or guilt as to whether it's suitable for charge or not. I think, defense solicitors who often deal with this are very, very supportive of using out-of-court disposals in the right way. The critical thing is that the suspects get that legal advice, because what shouldn't happen is that anybody should accept an out-of-court disposal if they aren't guilty, because it can give you a criminal record. So legal advice is absolutely critical. Gar, thank you very much for that. I'm afraid we need to move on because we've got other questions, which, we've got a lot of questions lined up, which we'd love to answer. So thanks very much, Gar. Alex, have you got another question?
Yes, I'm going to invite Ross to ask your question. I've allowed you to talk, so please unmute and feel free to go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. It was a question for yourself, Fionnuala. It was regarding the statistics over reconviction at the start of your presentation. I was just wondering if that had taken into consideration the different types of offences that were being compared against one another. So was a less serious offence more likely to get an out-of-court resolution versus something more serious, which you would expect to have a higher level of recidivism?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So they're from Ministry of Justice stats, and they do add some kind of factor into their calculations, which kind of factor in kind of the people, the kind of offender type or something as they call it. So it is factored in, but I think you're right. I think that to some extent kind of the types of crimes that come through in caution will have an impact on kind of likelihood of reoffending. But there's been research done elsewhere, which has kind of standardized all of that across cases. And still they found that even when you kind of standardize for offence type, etc., that caution reoffending or kind of out-of-court disposal reoffending is lower. There's difference is not quite so significant as we saw there, but it still is there.
Alex, thank you very much, Ross. Alex, have we got another question?
Yes, this was a question from Heather, who again could not ask live, and it's for Rick. How do we support or encourage decision makers and gatekeepers to justify the use of out-of-court disposals for offences where perhaps the public interest test is met, but there is still a recognised merit in diversion?
Well, I think supporting leaders, I mean, I think it's precisely this kind of work which is really encouraging. I mean, I think the key thing is to provide, I mean, the evidence base is strong and it's clear, and I think that needs to be communicated. And then I think the research that you guys have done should give some comfort to leaders who want to take this on, because it's quite clear that out there, the public does, these messages do resonate with people. They're more familiar with as I say, the more serious end of the criminal justice system. But that can be worked on. And I think, as Ali was saying, that's about local leadership. So I think getting this evidence base into the hands of PCCs, chief officers, operational leaders, and practitioners, that's the way to generate change in this area.
Great. Alex, have we got another question teed up?
Yes, we do. I'm going to invite Gemma to unmute and ask their question.
Gemma.
Hi there, thank you very much. I was really interested when you said we should avoid phrases around speedy and swift justice. The reason I was particularly interested is because at the moment in Scotland, we're obviously very involved in recover, renewal and transformation across the justice system. A lot of that is about digital innovations, and phrases like speedy, swift and efficient are being bandied about as the outcomes for exactly that. I just wondered if you could expand a wee bit more on why that should be avoided, really, so that I can utilise it and weaponise it, I think, in the future. Thank you.
Alison, have you got any experience of your own as to the reaction you get to the speedy justice idea?
Yeah, I think it depends on the victim. So I think there will be some victims who feel that they want to see something happen. They don't particularly want to go to court. They don't think the person has to go to court, and to do something quite swiftly and to be able to bring an end to whatever experience they've had is going to be important to that particular victim. So I feel personally that, and I can see what your report is saying about that wholesale discussion and use of swift and speedy can actually be damaging. But I think in certain circumstances, it can actually be quite positive, because sometimes people want to see something happen, and whatever you're proposing, they're happy with. And if we can do that sooner rather than later, it can be a good thing for that particular victim.
That's great. I would agree with that. And I just think we found other phrases we can use. And can I say, I think people would like the court process to be speedier, but we're talking about a completely different set of attitudes and beliefs there. And obviously a process which takes a huge amount of time. Alex, have we got another question teed up?
Yes, from an anonymous...
Sorry, you've muted. Yeah.
Sorry, I double-clicked the mute button, too speedy. From an anonymous attendee, they asked, were the examples in the research clear that diversion was being used instead of court? So do people support this instead of any other action, or do they just support it for specific things like referring to drug and alcohol support, where there wouldn't be another possible avenue?
Fionnuala.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good point. And partly it was just brevity on the slides. You know, we like nice, clean slides, but we were asking about kind of instead of court. So the long form version of the question was always about compared to court. Yeah, including the examples.
Great. Ali, I'm interested for you that the support from police officers for thinking that victims want their day in court was very low. So when we asked this police force, they felt that it was much more important for victims to have the crime acknowledged and to have some kind of punishment than to have the day in court. Is that your experience of where victims are?
I think it varies, to be honest, Penelope. As I said before, around what we were talking about, speedy and swift justice can mean one thing for one victim and something for another. So I think it depends. And of course, I understand that that particular finding was just from one force. Is that correct?
Yeah, but we've compared it to another force that we've been working with, and it was 200 officers. So it's a reasonable sample.
Yeah, and of course, what Rick was saying before about the importance of leadership, local leadership. I think that local leadership can have a really big impact on the culture of an organisation. So I think each force might be slightly different in terms of the local leadership and what that means for what police officers believe and their value system within that particular police service. I think you may well find a variance as you expand your research, but it's a very, very interesting one. I think that those particular officers may well have a particular experience of criminal justice within their own force that has led them to think that way.
Great. Alex, I think we've got one last question for Rick, I think. Could you tee it up?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and ask this one just because I haven't checked with the person that they're happy to answer live. But a question from Elizabeth asking how would you recommend that this data is used to influence supervisors and policymakers to shift policies and procedures towards potentially a more community-focused approach rather than this tough on crime mindset that we've seen in the media? And the context specifically here is in rural America, but I'm not sure how much you can speak to that area.
Well, I think that there's already, as Ali was saying, there are already some forces which are, taking a lead on this and have clearly got, that spread the word, and practitioners are engaged with it. Police officers are, using, I keep wanting to say diversion, but we're supposed to call it something else now. But
resolving crimes without going to court.
Yeah, exactly. Resolving crimes without going to court. They're resolving crimes without going to court. And so in some parts of the country that's happening already. I think in other parts of the country, it's a case of clearly you do need support from senior leadership. So I do think you need support from chief officers. You need support from the operational leadership of the force. You need support from the police and crime commissioner. But I think once you've got that in place, then it's a question of spreading the evidence base and putting in place the programs. I think it's pretty. The evidence, as I said before, the evidence is pretty compelling, I think, and I think when people get it, they get it, and I think my experience of seeing this being rolled out in some forces is that once officers have have got this agenda, they do run with it, and they can see that it's being successful. So I'm confident that this is going to spread, because I think the evidence base is there, and I think the will be there. As we saw, there's a lot of support for this within the police service, and I think that's a positive thing as well. But I think people probably do need some assurance that the public is on side, and I think the evidence here shows that could be the case, that public opinion is behind this, but people are not familiar with these kind of options.
That's great. We got to the end. This is a whistle-stop tour in this hour, and thank you so much to my guest, Commander Dr. Alison Heydari, Rick Muir, and to the team, Fionnuala and Alex, who've worked on this. I think there's a link there with all the resources, and we will email you afterwards as well. So thank you all very much, and I hope this is only the first in some conversations that we have about this great part of the justice system. I suppose just to sum up, the only thing I would say is I think there is a risk that we had under New Labour, where there were offences brought to justice, of just increasing out-of-court disposals for the sake of having more crimes formally resolved. I think the key is that it should be effective diversion, and where an out-of-court disposal is not relevant, but some diversion can be done, that can be just as effective, even though it's not measured and is not in the data. So thank you all very much indeed. And we will call off now from the call. And we've got a recording, so that will come around to anybody who might have missed this. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.